Hello, everyone. Happy to have you all here on the Universal Basic Income discussion. Together with me are Asta Kapoor, who is a co-founder of Apti Institute, a research firm examining the interface between tech and society. She works on data governance, basic income, digitization of welfare work, and social architectures of technology. And Carl Widerquist, who is a professor of political philosophy at Georgetown University in Qatar, specializing in distributive justice, the ethics of who has what. Much of his work involves universal basic income. He's a co-founder of the US Basic Income Guarantee Network, and he served as a co-chair of the Basic Income Earth Network for about 10 years. Justice. Eric Rogers, who is a scholar, organizer, designer, and artist. Happy to have you all here and start the discussion on UBI. I will start with a question for Carl. Carl, you are defining basic income in one of your talks as a system where you pay for what you own and get paid for what you don't own. If you could please elaborate on that.
Well, yes, that's talking about how about relating basic income to really the most basic ideas of how the property rights system works. For most of the time that humans were on this planet, for the first 200,000 years or so that our species existed, most of the earth was a commons where you could use it, but you couldn't own it. You could hunt, gather, fish, and scavenge on it, but you couldn't really own anything except for what you caught. And most of the world's resources are not like that. The atmosphere still is. We can all breathe as we want, but no one owns the atmosphere. And I think we'd all be pretty upset if some entrepreneur came along and said, oh, I've improved the atmosphere, I now own it. You now all have to work for me to get permission to breathe. That would be a horrible thing. But yet we have to have the same permission to satisfy our other most basic needs. In many places in the world, you have to pay to drink water. And just about everywhere in the world, you have to pay the owners of resources in order to make your own food or build your own shelter. They own the resources, you don't. We took what was a common resource for everyone and we gave it to a few. The government said, this is the ownership group, this isn't. They get to trade this stuff around, but you don't get anything at all. What you have to do in order to get property is work for this group. So this group is owners and you are workers. Now the groups are a little bit fluid, but actually social mobility is a lot less than it ought to be. And a lot of people who are born into this group stay in this group. And a lot of people who are born into that group stay in that group. And there's nothing fair or just about a system where we divide resources and some get them and some don't. If you're going to divide resources, you need to divide them in some way that everybody gets a share. Now, we could divide resources completely equally, but that's a really inefficient way to do things, and it's hard to figure out what exactly we mean by equal. We've got, think about land where all of us are in North America, in Asia, in Europe, and in the north, in the south, in the center, in the mountains, by the water, in the deserts. What's exactly an equal amount of land, and what's an equal value of resources? And it's sometimes valuable to say, okay, you're going to run this company and you're going to control a bunch of resources, but you're going to benefit us by running this company. Sometimes we can have somebody have more resources. So the way we can make it equal and reciprocal, where all the duties that we place on one person, we place on another, is to have a system where if you control resources, if you use resources up, you pay for them. And you get paid for what everybody else is using. So you can have a wealth tax or a land value tax or a resource use tax or a rent tax, or even an income tax can be a form of doing things like this, where you're paying for the acquisition of resources. When you pay a tax, it's not buying services from the government. It is paying your rent to the community for controlling and using, or maybe even using up resources. And that money goes back to the people, goes back to everyone else in the form of basic income. So if you get basic income and nothing else, then that's your reward. You then consume this, not only resources, but services provided by other people as your reward for being a low resource user. But if you pay big taxes and so receive only a very small basic income, then you are, then that is your fee for using or using up a lot of the Earth's resources. So it is really the best way to make the property rights system consistent with the idea of reciprocity.
Mm-hmm. Now let's see how, because ASTA was part of a pilot project of implementing universal basic income in India. ASTA, how was developed the project, and what were the outcomes of it?
Yeah, so this was a project that happened in one part of India in 2010-11. So it was a while ago, before we had been able to create the infrastructure to reach people money. So a lot of our time went into opening these bank accounts. Also, the basic income transfer was about $2.50 per month per person. It doesn't sound like a lot, but at the household level, it ended up being about a fourth of people's monthly incomes. So we thought that it was not enough to replace employment, but it was, sufficient to give a little bit of additional, income to the households. Also, children got, the half of that, so about $1.50. The children under 18 got as tied to their mother. So I think that one of our bigger learnings was that, and I think this is something that we had set out to do, is to challenge the question of, if you put cash in people's hands, they will spend it on things that don't matter. There's a lot of like paternalism that comes with thinking about putting cash in people's hands. And I think that our pilot demonstrated that people spend money on things that they need. So we saw a lot of addition to and diversification of people's food choices. Money was spent on children's education. There was also expenditure seen on things like house repairs. Of course, there were people who spent the cash, they sort of collected it over the course of the year and spent it on religious, religious trips. But that's something that those expenditures would have happened irrespective. Also, I think that we, at the time, implemented the pilot also in an extremely poor tribal village that was very disconnected. And we saw that there was some amount of pooling of resources to create assets for the community, which was very interesting. But again, I think that the lessons from the India basic income pilot were that this was done by a civil society organization, Seva. It was funded by UNICEF. So it was not a question of, where do you get the money from? Because it was just as an addition. So all the government schemes and programs of food subsidy, of education, of health, they were all running. And this was an addition to all of that. And I think that is a question that keeps coming up all the time. Do you give basic income as a substitution or an addition? And then the second thing is that what really impacted our work at the time was that the digital infrastructure to reach people, the money didn't exist. I mean, and that's something that we're seeing even now. The US is sending checks to people as part of the COVID relief, and which are going by post. So, that infrastructure is critical to making sure that you are able to reach money directly into the account. And also, I think that, like I said, I think the question of, is it going to be a substitution for existing schemes and programs, or is it going to be in addition to it? And if it is indeed in addition, then where are we going to find the money for it? And those are some questions that we just sort of sidestepped at the time, because the objective of the pilot was to show that you can do a basic income in India, that people do spend the money on prudent decisions, and it's not something that replaces work. because in 2010 we were fighting a lot of these stereotypes that I guess still exist right now.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Thank you, Asta. Now I have another question for Carl. The idea of basic income first appeared more than 200 years ago. How is it different now, the concept of UBI and the support it is gaining now from 200 years ago?
Well, it was first defined in the 1790s by a man named Thomas Spence. He was writing in response to Thomas Paine's famous pamphlet, Agrarian Justice, where Thomas Paine said there should be a big payment when people come of age, and then a small payment from age 50 every year for the rest of their life. But his arguments for this were to create, very much the kind of things that I was talking about before, about compensating people for the loss of access to the commons, and to get them access to the resources that they need so that they wouldn't have to just work for whatever jobs that they could get. But Thomas Spence said, well, there's a way to do this better. If you really want to make sure that everybody is free in this sense, don't just have one big payment when people come of age and then wait for the next payment till you're 50. Have a universal payment to all citizens or all residents once a year throughout their entire lives. And that is the idea of basic income. It was invented by him, but he's not a well-known figure. So it was reinvented several times in the mid 1800s and the early 20th century. It was invented again. And it developed a close cousin, which is sometimes called a guaranteed minimum income or the negative income tax, which is the idea of something like a universal payment, except for we're only going to give it to those whose income wouldn't otherwise get them up to that point. That is the negative income tax. And that was very popular in the United States and in Canada, and to some extent in Britain in the late 60s and the 1970s. It was very close to getting enacted in the United States during that period. There was a lot of political movement around, but with politicians like Reagan and Thatcher and the idea of dismantling the website, the idea of really improving it with a universal payment of this kind went away. And it went away, especially in the United States and Britain and to a large extent in Canada, but it appeared here and there in various places, for a while in the Netherlands, for a while in Denmark, for a while in South Africa. Here and there, it's coming and going. The idea and the academic discussion of this idea was picking up in the 80s and the 90s and the 2000s. And then with the financial meltdown of 2008 and 2009 and the Great Recession that followed, and with the political activism that happened that time, it started with the Arab Spring, and then that influence spread to the 99% movement, the Occupy movement, Black Lives Matter, and a bunch of other things. A lot of this brought attention to basic income. This was helped by things like that experiment in India that Asta was talking about. That was actually the second of two new experiments. There hadn't been an experiment in anything like basic income since the 1970s. But yet Namibia and India, two lesser developed countries, not big famous, not big wealthy Western countries, two countries outside the political centers of power, started experimenting with this and showing that this works. And that helped people, when people were looking for a different model, look at this basic income model. So a lot of things came together for basic income to start picking up strength at this time. And I was writing the news for basic income this time, so I was following it very closely. And you could tell from about 2011, 2012 that it was picking up. And then the next year it picked up more, and it picked up more. And here it is, 2020, and it is still picking up more and more. Of course, we had the Andrew Yang campaign where he made it the centerpiece of his policy. And then we have this COVID recession and the Trump recession at the same time. And people are looking at an emergency universal basic income as a way to help both cushion the economy from from this big economic downturn we're having, and to do two other things: to provide a cushion for the individuals who are saying, look, stay home. You're not an essential worker, please stay home. This universal payment gives them a cushion, but it also gives a bonus to the people who are working, the people who are saying, you're an essential worker, please keep working even though it's dangerous. It gives a bonus, some hazard pay for them, and it comes back for these reasons, but it also is coming back for another reason, is that we have been targeting policies in one way or another for 100 years. In some cases, back to the late 19th century, we've been using these targeted programs, and the targeted programs have never delivered what they have promised, which is the elimination of poverty and feelings of greater respect for people who are receiving them. And we're realizing this model doesn't work, and people are looking for another model. Basic income has been studied and experimented with, and it is a very different model. Instead of a targeted policy, it's a universal program. It's given to everybody. You can tax it back from whoever you want, but it's universal, much like the pension system in the United States, which is nearly universal, but not completely universal. And because it's universal, it has no cracks to fall through, no mistakes of targeting, and it creates greater feelings of solidarity. It's not always the constant target of people who are trying to vilify recipients. They always want to treat anybody who's eligible for a conditional program. Oh, you're a potential criminal. Maybe you're a cheat. Those are the bad people. You're the good people who don't need programs. Social Security in the United States doesn't have that way. It doesn't have that sort of a stigma because everybody gets it. Universal health care, which they have in most countries, but not in the United States, isn't looked at that way because everyone gets it. We need a universal basic income, which won't be looked at that way once everyone gets it.
Nice. Mm-hmm. Thanks. Zarina, do you have any questions or question for Asta? Anouk, what was the removal of stigma? Was the removal of stigma something you experienced in the pilot?
How do you mean removal of stigma against or for giving cash in the hand of people?
Yeah, I mean, basically what Carl described just now, which is that if we give it to everyone, there's not such a stigma attached to receiving any kind of like social welfare.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering, I know the pilot was a little different, but I'm wondering if that's something that came up in that pilot as well.
Yeah, I think so. I think that, in fact, I think there was some resistance at the universalism in the beginning where people, I think from, communities that sort of, even within the village, the low income communities felt like the upper class should not get the income, only they should get it. But I think that over time, when we were able to explain why that's important, I think that there was greater support to universalism. I think that India, particularly in rural India, there's a lot of reliance on state support. So the stigma of accessing support is not that much, I believe, even though it's an extremely undignified experience to go through accessing support. So we had also thought that directly giving cash in people's hand is also going to be a way to provide them dignity and choice. But again, like I said, it was a different time in terms of being able to actually put money in people's hands because the banking infrastructure was not there. So there was a process of indignity even in accessing the money, because you go to a bank, the bank personnel is not very, it's not incentivized to service you. So it just becomes a huge burden to even access your entitlement. In contrast, I think accessing, subsidized food from the network is a much more familiar process for a lot of people, and they know how to negotiate that. So accessing cash through the banking system, I think, was maybe a process of even more greater indignity for a lot of people because it was new and unfamiliar. But just the stigma of receiving benefits is not something that we didn't necessarily encounter just because of the context, but definitely there was a sense of why them, why everybody between the groups that were receiving the cash.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. Zarina, do you have a question?
I have a question for everybody, really. So, Carl, I hear that for you, universal basic income is a way of sort of like undoing some of the property rights sort of injustices that we currently have. And also, Asta, I have for you, in your experiment or your experience, people were only getting a sort of proportion of their income, so it wasn't enough to stop work. And I guess my broad question is, you know, under what conditions do you both or all of you think universal basic income is actually transformational for society, such that it undoes the sort of underlying economic logic and sort of access to a really good quality of life? And sort of conversely, under what conditions do you think a universal basic income might just propagate the sort of current system and the current economic logic that we already have? So yeah, that's for everyone.
Okay, should I start out? I think it is certainly going to be transformational if it's large enough. If it's very small, it'll be insignificant. But it can be very transformational in ways that we can't really foresee. We can foresee some of the things, but not other things, or how extensive that they will be. I am really not interested in the debate between capitalism and socialism, because I find this to be the debate between vagueness and vagueness. There are a million ways to define capitalism and a million ways to define socialism, and most of them overlap. You know, the only definition of socialism I seem to think should be consistent is it's anything that conservatives in the United States don't like. That's what socialism is. So everything is socialism. Now, but if you define capitalism as a system where the working class has no other choice but to sell their labor to survive, if that's how you define capitalism, then basic income ends capitalism. Now, if you define capitalism is a system where people privately own the means of production and they make returns on that, it does not alter that essential element of the system. But I do not.
No.
Oh no.
We lost Carl.
Carl.
The cliffhanger.
What?
Carl, we lost you. We lost you for a second then.
Oh no.
We lost you. So you said, you know, if we define capitalism as the ownership of the means of production, the privatization of the means of production, then universal basic income does not undermine that. And then we lost you.
Yes. Now, so what is then capitalism if it still has this element where private ownership of the means of production, even though they're paying their taxes and they're avoiding regulations, so they have less power to that, but you have this more power for really everyone else who's not a wealthy owner has this power where they do not have to take jobs if the jobs aren't good enough for them. That gives them power, and that fixes the real incentive problem that we have in this economy in the world today. Is we have a really classist idea of what the incentive problems are. We always say, oh, workers don't have an incentive to work if you give them basic income. No, the problem is right now, employers don't have incentive to pay good wages and offer good working conditions and to pass on the benefits of growth that we've all contributed to. Basic income fixes that incentive problem. If you won't pay me well, if you won't give me a good wage, if you won't let me share in the benefits of growth, I will not work for you. Now, if basic income is high, that could very much transform society. How much it will do so, I don't know. It also ends women's financial dependence on men, which is still very real in the world today. Now, it doesn't completely end it, because if you're used to living at $100,000 a year and you've got to go and live off of $15,000 or $20,000 a year basic income, that's a pretty big hit. But it ends where you absolutely need it, especially if it's combined with universal health care and good universal education.
Amazing. Yeah, Eric, what's that?
I mean, my only, I think I worry about a certain enthusiasm for basic income now, largely because of the way it, and I started off as a big supporter, but also because it's being framed as a way to, you know, the government doesn't need to be there. You just give the cash to people, and then it's going to be fine. There's also a way for, you know, we've seen huge amounts of support for basic income with Silicon Valley, which I think is a bit of a red flag for this question, largely because this has then become a way for Silicon Valley to, you know, automate the jobs that they have to do as they please without the responsibility of thinking about people, because, oh, we just give them the income and that's about it. And this sort of will force people to take the shit jobs because there are, you know, there is a certain universal basic income. This is not, I mean, and I understand that everybody who talks about it in the context of, you know, there should be universal healthcare, there should be, you know, education, there should be an additional basic income. But I read this wonderful quote is that, you know, sufficient basic income is unaffordable and affordable basic income is insufficient. So within that, you know, I think it becomes very, very complex. And I think that we should be aware of the growing politics around basic income as well. It matters who supports this. It matters who's propagating for it. And I think that big tech getting behind basic income is a really big concern for me, largely because it just becomes an excuse to do as you please, as we've seen them doing in different aspects of our lives.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Carl, do you have something?
Yeah, I want to respond to this allegation, which we get on basic income very often, that they supposedly will say, well, sufficient basic income is unaffordable and an affordable basic income is insufficient. And that's a nice little alliteration you got going, you know, in that sentence that critics will say, but it doesn't have truth in it. That is always done by exaggerating the cost of basic income. Is that basic income is a universal payment, but also you're going to support that. You're going to support the value of currency while you're pumping all this money into the economy by pulling some money back out of the economy through taxes. And these are going to be paid for by people at the upper end of the income and the wealth, the ownership distribution. Some people are going to be net beneficiaries. Some people are going to be net payers. But almost all of us are going to receive for the basic they're going to receive a basic income and pay taxes. And those two things cancel each other out. You have to pay attention to that. Basic income is actually a very cheap and affordable program if you look at the net cost. If you look at the fact that most of what you're paying is people paying themselves. If I'm, say, the only poor person in this room and you all give me $1, that's going to cost you each $1, and you all have $1 less. But if the government says, okay, we're going to make this program universal, now we want you each to give $4 to yourself. How much more does that cost you? Nothing. It doesn't cost you anything to give $1 to yourself. And when you look at the net cost, my calculations show that poverty line basic income in the United States would cost about 2.95% of GDP. If you want a much larger one that's about $20,000 a year, that would cost less than 10% of GDP. And when you consider how much GDP has grown in the last 50 years and who's benefited from that, just the people in the top 1%, yes, they can afford to take a hit in what they're getting so that the rest of us can never have to fear poverty.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder whether it's valuable too to make a distinction between sort of taxes and dividends. Yanis Varoufakis, the former Greek Minister of Finance, pointed out that in his view, UBI becomes this sort of non-reformist reform, or like a much more revolutionary thing when we stop thinking about it as merely just redistributing some of the income in society from taxation, that is taxing the wealthy. And when we start thinking of it as people starting to own a larger and larger share of all of the sort of productive industries. And then it becomes less about an expensive, tax and more about people are just owners of these firms. So it actually starts to shift the ownership of productive assets in the favor of people.
Yeah, and that's actually would be a really interesting way to finance basic income. if instead of having a tax in money, we had a tax on corporations in stock ownership. So every year, 1% of the ownership of a corporation, or a corporation larger than a certain size, goes into this fund. And then the dividends on that fund go to support a basic income. But also that means the people control an ever-growing amount of stock each year. That would be a really interesting way to do it. It's hard to foresee what that would be like. I've not studied that. That's not something I've ever written about, but I do find it as a fascinating way to be some or potentially all of the basic income financing. I think would be a really interesting way to do it. That, because we got to remember that it's really not about, even if it's just, you're just taxing the wealthy and giving it to everybody else, it's really not about money. It is about power. Mm-hmm. When you give people the power to control enough assets to keep themselves alive, you are giving them a power that most of us, not just the very poor, but most of us in the middle class lack. And how that will change the power dynamics in the country is hard to imagine. Now, what we add what you're talking about is also then giving that same group of people power over the corporation. Mm-hmm. Through their stock ownership. That would be amazing.
Yeah. And I think it also speaks to, you know, the thing you said at the beginning, which was, you know, about sort of access to resources. And if a corporation has access to resources, it sort of goes one step beyond and says, well, what are you doing with those resources? If you are generating profit off somebody else's labor through those resources, some proportion of that should go back to, you know, the global population, which is very different from private property rights. And so it incorporates what you are doing with this privatized resource, as well as the fact that it's a privatized resource, which is, I think, really interesting. Yeah. I
have a question about one of the issues I think we might see with pilot programs specifically, like testing out universal basic income in these small batches, is that you're going to see all the costs and like a relatively few of the benefits. And what I mean by that is, presumably, if you just give a small subset of the population a universal basic income, they're going to be continuing to live in capitalist cities and in places, you know, environments really, social and spatial, that are designed for the perpetuation of commerce. And one of the things I think would be a real advantage, and Carl, you already were talking a bit about this in one of your previous answers, of a universal basic income, is the way that it then empowers all these other types of activities and economies and arguably, you know, spatial environments where we get to do things that aren't just remunerated labor or commodity consumption. So I guess it's a sort of question about the validity of pilot programs for showing those kinds of aggregated benefits, but also one of infrastructure. You know, today, if you're not working, you're basically classified and pathologized as idle. And you'd only ever get that in a city that has nothing that doesn't cost money to do, these sort of policed, horrible places. But I wonder how sort of cities or like our actual environments might play a role in making something like a small income for all, places of possibility and emancipation, where there are things to do and places to go and people to interact with. None of those things, none of those benefits are going to sort of show up in a pilot program because you're just not getting the aggregate effects of all of those benefits.
Right.
I'm glad you brought that up because I wrote a book on that topic.
Yay!
Called The Critical Analysis of Basic Income Experiments. It's on Palgrave Macmillan Press, and that's one of the issues that I hit about that is you test some things and not others, and some of the things that you test, you actually test pretty poorly, and that what it can do is that it can distract attention from what you really want to know to what is most easy to test. Mm-hmm. And that was a huge problem in the 1970s experiments, and I wrote about that in a paper some time ago, and then recently in a book with all these new experiments coming out. And there's one problem with it, is that one of the easiest things to measure is how many hours a week did the recipients of this experimental basic income work. And then people will say, oh, look, they work less. That's a horrible thing. The lower class is working less. This is a failure. Well, I don't think the lower class is working the right amount right now. And if you want to get what I think is really important, an incentive for employers to pay better wages, you need to give the working class the power to work less. Now, what you need to do on an experiment to make it worthwhile is to focus on the worthwhile things that it can show. And that is, I think, to focus on its effects, not its side effects. What is its effect on childhood nutrition? What is its effect on low birth weight babies? What is its effect on education among children? And all of this, the India study, the Canadian study, and some other studies did a very good job of focusing on these issues and not being distracted by these other issues that demagogues are going to cover. But some of the important things, how will it transform the labor market if we really get it and it's all over the country? That is impossible to test with an experiment. And we can't, and if we're going to run experiments, we can't let them distract attention from how important issues like that are.
Yeah. Just to sort of add to that, I think that, I mean, we were unable to track any long-term metrics for well-being, right? So one of the metrics for nutrition is height for age, but we were just unable to track that because that's a long-term, long-term indicator. So we did get weight for age, but that's not such a good indicator for any kind of nutrition. Just on pilots, and if I may, and not because I support pilots, but I think that they are in some ways a useful tool for policy making. At the end of the day, you need to go to the government because the government needs to pay for universal basic income. I think that's the big thing here, because everything that we've seen so far has been, money has been found in ways that is not coming from the tax or the dividends or whatever sustainable ways of paying for basic income. You have the Give Directly pilots in Kenya that are going for a much longer period, and the results are starting to come in now, but those are also philanthropic, donation money. So I think that pilots, to a certain extent, at least the way that we did it in, when we had done the pilots, was a lot of research and findings were able to be positioned to the government, which at the time was contemplating, moving certain kinds of subsidies to cash, trying to see what possibilities there were. And I think, what the government of India has done is it has, instead of universal basic income, given some kind of precedence to cash transfers, which is just the wrong interpretation of the experiment. But yeah, I absolutely agree. We have no way. Maybe MinCom in some ways is the place to study this a little bit more.
Yeah, that's one of the interesting factors about the current wave of interest in basic income versus the one in the 60s and 70s. The one in the 60s and 70s was very close to the centers of power. There's some welfare activists who were very much in support of it, and there was a big gap where the middle class knew little about it, and then people at the top were interested in it largely for different reasons than they were. So a lot of government money went into it. And those 5 experiments in the US and Canada from 1968 to 1980 were all government financed, and because of that, they were all very large. And gathered lots of data. Today, a lot of the, almost all, not most of the experiments are not government financed. They're NGO financed, as Ashta was saying. And that means you can have a large experiment in a poor country or a small experiment in a wealthy country. And in the United States, we have several small experiments going on right now. Well, you'll learn a little more than you will from a large experiment. So that is definitely a problem with the current experiments. It's also says something, I think, about politics today, which is as much interest in there is in basic income. It's hard to get government money behind it.
Yeah, I think there's something, we sort of interchangeably use this language, pilot, prototype, experiment, exploration, and they all mean different things. And I think it is really important to clock that the metrics we use when we design actual experiments are very political, right? They embody our, and this is true in all science, you know, the metrics you use and the sort of hypotheses that you drive embody your sort of original stance, you know. And I think we all like to think that we're sort of like scientific robots that are completely neutral, but of course we're not. And so the sort of scientific tool, the sort of microscope, or the, you know, the tool does sort of tend to show us what we want to look at. And I think for me, the experiments and the pilots that have happened have been an extraordinary game changer in shifting our cultural narrative about what's possible, you know. So often humans, if you ask them, oh, can you imagine something like, you know, universal basic income, or insert any other thing, they sort of say, oh, they'll often sort of ask to look at examples. And you see this all the time, you know. We like to look at sort of other tribes that have maybe been less sort of touched by developed culture, or, you know, sort of Western culture, and we sort of like to look at them for like models of like our romantic relationships and what are human universals. We're always looking for examples to prove that this is a thing humans could do, which is interesting because humans appear to be very fluid and plastic and sort of culturally able to do a ton of different things. So for me, the pilots and the experiments are in many ways a way of sort of putting the flag in the sand and saying, look, we could do this. It could happen. But what it can't do is get us to an understanding of what a global universal basic income might look like, because that's, you know,
Yeah.
or even what a national basic income or a regional basic income.
Yeah.
And the closest we're coming for what is with this Kenyan experiment, which is over a fairly large rural geographical area.
Yeah.
And also about a 10-year period and testing at different times. So that's going to be interesting. But to your point, Tarina, I think that it's super interesting because even in the India experiment, like, just like you said, like just to demonstrate the possibility of what can happen, these pilots are useful. I mean, we never thought that you could deliver money directly in the hands of the people. It involved us taking bags of cash across, you know, the country and delivering them to the people, and that just didn't seem possible at the time. And also to the, you know, to the point of the stereotypes of how people might spend it, what they might do with it, etc., what the impact might be, all of those were bent a little bit, and we were able to demonstrate that. But also I do agree with you, Carl. I think that you in pilots, you're always just going after what you can test and measure, and not just even test the measurability numbers. Like, I think that is something that any kind of texture beyond that is something that we lose out on immensely, because you're just looking for hard numbers to report at the end of the year or 2 years or whatever you have. So any kind of deeper analysis of how it's changing social relations, society, all of that is completely missed out. And despite like all of us trying to do ethnographic research around that. And the media wants that number. They want, you know, you can say, okay, here's the number we found, and here's the story of how what this indicates about how a national UBI might work. You can tell that story, but the media will be like, ooh, number, look, let's report that number.
Yeah. I have a question, which, you know, sort of on the topic of social reproduction, which you just sort of touched on, which is just to, I guess, to Eric and everybody to think about the sort of the ethics and the sort of spatial consequences of this. So one of the things I really clocked early on, Asa, in your description, was that sometimes people collectivize, you know, and that's like fascinating. So I thought it'd be interesting just to sort of hear a little bit more about what we sort of think the sort of social elements of this might be. Do you want to speak to that?
Well, I can speak to the spatial aspect specifically. I recently wrote a thing about like what might post-industrious cities in a UBI world look like. So tackling this question, I sort of mentioned a little bit in my question earlier about how cities right now, they're just designed for people who work and or have money from the sort of like from normative capitalist processes, right? And that's true for housing. This is true for entertainment. Like all the places that we have in our cities are designed with the assumption that you have not just a small amount of income, but a lot of income. And you gain access to space by having income. And so I guess I wonder what a city might look like that's designed for a world where lots of people have a small amount of universal basic income coming in. What might housing look like? Like, I think there are all sorts of movements that are starting to prefigure this a bit, and they're not doing it within the frame of universal basic income, but I think of the tiny home movement, people doing all sorts of homesteading and whatnot. Like, people are trying to imagine a world where they don't have to work. And I think lots of people are anticipating that either for themselves or for lots of people who are put out of work from automation. So I think people are thinking about like a non-work lifestyle, but it hasn't reached our cities really. And so, yeah, I also think a lot about this question of like idleness and how we just pathologize people who are out of work. And I think it's interesting to look at some of, I don't want to claim all of it is due to this, but some of this like current policing crisis and the sort of addiction epidemics that are sort of rattling the United States. Like, a lot of these are sort of examples of people just like not having environments that are suitable for like human habitation. And I'm super into the idea that we could actually redesign our cities on the basis of not constantly working, because the thing is, like, even if we implemented a UBI, we would still have these crappy cities that are super alienating and cold and heavily policed and enforced. So I really want to think about like the environments that we could have as a result of having universal basic income.
Well, I think the mere existence of universal basic income will have some effect on what you're talking about. And I'm not a geographer. I love geography, but I'm not a geographer. So you really need a geographer on this kind of thing. But maybe an economic geographer, because a lot of it also has to do with the zoning laws, urban planning decisions, and our real estate policy that allows speculators to control so much of the land in our cities and let so much of it lie vacant for speculative reasons and just banking on stuff. In southern, three of you are in southern England, and you know all about how expensive this is. Those things are going to, just a basic income, without changing those things, I don't think will have a big impact. But if you change those things, those three things, along with basic income, we could get a major redesign of our cities, but not my area of expertise.
Asta, do you have any thoughts on?
Yeah,
I
mean, just on the point of collectivization, one of the things I think that there was, it was very hard to study this, but I think that the sense we got is that there's a general generosity that was noticed during the experiment. People were more willing to help each other out. People were more sort of willing to pool resources and build something that was collective. So we remember that there was some conversation about getting like a sort of village temple going, seeing if there was any possibility of creating some kind of common spaces. So it seemed like the investment, because people regarded, and again, this is the problem of the pilot, right? It was not considered an entitlement. It was considered, a short-term gift. So there were some sort of framing issues. And I think that because it was considered to be a short-term additional income, people were like, oh, we should collectivize it and put it towards something big, as opposed to using it as an income for your day-to-day life. So I think that was the problem of the short-term pilot as well. And I don't know what this would be like if the basic income was to go on for a longer time. And then there's a shift in imagination that goes from, gift to entitlement. And I don't think that the people that we were working with considered it an entitlement.
Wow, that's interesting. Yeah. Great. Okay. So I think I roughly have, so we touched on under what conditions do we think this is like deeply transformational for society. And I think what I hear is that for Carl, this is a first step for you. First step to a sort of broader transformational.
Well, it has to be combined with other things, universal education, universal health care, and other reforms. But I do think that the most fundamental thing we do is we separate the vast majority of humanity from the resources they need to survive. So to me, this is the most fundamental of all changes, where no longer do the privileged people of the world hold this over the majority of people. You don't get access to the resources you need to survive unless you do what we tell you. So I do think this is the most important of all those reforms, but it's certainly not the only important.
So it's the first step. It's not a replacement for services. We also need universal basic services or access to services. It's not supposed to be a replacement for other forms of welfare and philanthropy and other kinds of resources out there. I think we've heard that people feel like it has to be enough. What enough is an open question, but it seems like it has to be above a certain, it has to take everybody above a certain threshold for it to actually be something that frees people from involuntary labor and so on and so forth. Ideally, it would be sourced from those who hold private resources, perhaps as corporate dividends, which would also service sort of democratizing the means of production as well. Any other conditions that we want to add to the list?
I heard something, well, I think I read something about the role that environmentalism is playing in this activism, and how we could, for example, setting a price for on carbon emissions would be another way of funding the UBI.
My point is slightly more functional. I just feel like we need to have the systems to reach this money. I think that making sure that it's at the individual level, and because I think that there are several suggestions, at least in India, that are floating around. It's like, put it at the household level, give it to just the women, all of that. No, it needs to be for every adult individual, and it needs to be made sure that you have the systems to put that money in a way that people can access it without any friction.
Right.
Yeah.
No, I think those are great conditions. Andrew, did you? Yeah.
Let's look at Carl had something to say.
Great.
Oh, well, I was actually going to say that in the chat here, it says, Asha said, I would love to know what everyone thinks about the libertarian interest in UBI. Should we
let's
look
do
at
it.
that question? Okay, I'll tell you, my take is that it is more diverse than we give it credit for. And also, we need to separate this libertarian interest in UBI. There is a wealthy person interest in UBI, and there's a tech entrepreneur interest in UBI, and those might have some overlap with the libertarian or not. Now, even if some of these people want to give very small crumbs, some people, there's been this idea on the table since the 1960s of getting rid of all other forms of redistribution of income and replacing that with basic income, often a very low basic income. James Buchanan had a version like this. He won a Nobel Prize. These versions of basic income, those you have to be very suspicious of. If the basic income is large enough, it can replace a lot of other things. I don't know anyone on food stamps who wouldn't prefer cash instead of food stamps. Food stamps are these special poor people's money we have in the United States, where you can only buy it on certain kinds of food, and people can always tell when you're at the store paying on it, so you can be really good and stigmatized. But it is it's nearly universal. If you need it, you can get it, and it does help a lot of people. But replacing that with basic income, if long as you're not going to cut the basic income the next year, is almost an improvement for everybody. That's not true in the current real estate climate of all public housing. It's really hard to replace New York public or subsidized housing with a basic income that's actually large enough that you're still going to be able to live in New York. So we're going to replace some things and not others. You got to look out for those proposals. Now, the motivations of these people are also very different. There are some wealthy people who have not forgotten where they come from and actually care very much. Chris Hughes of Facebook only worked for Facebook for 3 years and now has $500 million, and he knows he didn't earn that money. And he's been putting a lot of support into basic income, as some Canadian entrepreneurs have, and the guy who founded Twitter now seems to be getting into this. Some of these people are actually really sincere people. Other people might be trying to give a few crumbs here to eliminate the welfare state. You got to look out for those differences. Now, among libertarians, not all libertarians are rich, and there's at least two kinds of libertarians. Some libertarians are in love with the market. And they just think the market is a good way to solve problems, and that maybe a market with a basic income would work really well, and it's better than the government having all these targeted programs that are gonna interfere with the market. These people might have good basic income programs. There are other libertarians that are libertarians just because they're in love with rich people. They don't want anything to come interfere, and their motivation is always going to be, how do you lower taxes and regulations on rich people? Mm-hmm. Those people are going to have a lot worse program. So the diversity among these people, we've got to look at, just because they're coming from a wealthy or a pro-market background doesn't mean everything that they say is bad, but you do need to be suspicious and don't think of them as monolithic.
Yeah.
No, I think that's fair. I think that, I guess I would be curious to understand, what everybody thought of, say, for instance, Mark Zuckerberg's interest in universal basic income, because from the way it's positioned, it does seem like a way for, the government to recede, for them to be able to incentivize their disruptive technologies. It just seems like a way to absolve themselves of a certain kind of guilt. Whether that's rich people guilt, whether there's other kinds of guilt, I don't know. But it does, so the intent behind the policy then also becomes important in a certain way.
Well, if the program is transformational and you can get certain people who would otherwise be the big enemies of it because you're playing on their guilt or something, that's not such a bad thing. Because I don't think most of the world is going to be for basic income because of this guilt idea, because they're so wealthy. But if you get a few of those who are, then you have less opposition to it. It's not necessarily a bad thing.
I've been thinking a bit about how, rather than thinking of dependence on universal basic income versus market dependence as being the only two options, I feel like there's kind of three, and they all interact in really interesting ways. So it's market dependence on the state in one way or another, whether through UBI or otherwise, and then sort of self-sufficiency. And I feel like there are some interesting strategies that can be woven between the three. So I've thought a lot about how if the current economic crisis really turns into a really deep depression where tons of people are out of work and therefore are suddenly extremely dependent on the state, it might suddenly be in the interest of really wealthy people to push for policies that actually allow people to become self-sufficient rather than market sufficient. So it's always been the alternative of being government sufficient that you then become market sufficient, because we've needed all these laborers, basically a major labor force. But there's this whole other option, which suddenly could become really palatable if you're a rich person who doesn't like the idea of supporting everyone on government roles forever, or having to find some weird bullshit way to work them into your employment roles. Mm-hmm. So I don't know, just the idea that big bad socialism might be this expensive thing that causes people to actually back people having sort of local communitarian communism of sorts, mm-hmm. Has been a sort of idea that's been wishing around in my head.
And that is a third thing of basic income that it can do is it can do that. I don't think that's going to happen for everybody. 37 million people in New York and similar 37 million people in Tokyo and 21 in New York, and similar sizes in 2 or 3 cities in India, maybe more. Not all of those people are going to be able to go out and live some kind of different lifestyle. It's going to be live off your basic income in an urban environment or supplement it with work. But there are people who are doing this now. In Alaska, it's so funny when I'm reading, Alaska has a yearly dividend which has been chopped away, but it has at some times been fairly substantial. It's been chopped away in recent years. But when I was studying this, you found certain complaints from employers. Well, some of these people, they get their dividend and they quit their job as a waiter, and they go buy fishing equipment, and they go and they live off the land for a few months until they run out of stuff, and then only then do they come back to work. I'm like, well, more power to them. What, you think they live a better life if they're waiting tables, 12 months a year rather than they're off, fishing and living off the land or whatever? And some native communities in Canada that have some money have actually created dividends specifically targeted to letting people live a traditional Native American or Native Canadian lifestyle for that area, which I think in that area is mostly hunting, fishing, and gathering. And that, I think, is a really interesting idea. And also the idea that people could, okay, we live in the city, we're going to band together, we're going to use our basic incomes and buy or rent this place out in the wilderness and start a commune. I think you will get some people doing that. Some of those things will be big failures, but some of those will be really interesting, cool ideas.
I do think there also is just like an agrarian, often conservative utopia that people have in their minds that tends to be different from the like state managed socialist utopia that maybe many urban people in cities dream about. And I think it's worth remembering that a lot of in the United States, like Republicans are animated by this sort of agrarian utopia. I'm not talking about like the Republican Party, like wealthy corporate interests, but lots of everyday folks who sort of, I don't know, who are dreaming of a different kind of world, but different
people who have civic Republican philosophy.
Totally, yeah. And
Which
so
has nothing whatsoever to do with the Republican Party in the U.S. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's worth just remembering that there are these other visions of sort of utopia beyond, being a wage slave that belong to different groups of people in the United States, and maybe if you're going to create advocacy for like a different type of wealth distribution, you need to be able to speak those different kinds of like languages and speak to those different types of aspirations, and not just be stuck in the fully urban state subsidized utopia of socialism.
But you're also going to see, I think, more of that now, because I mean, as this reality of working from home and using technology, all of that becomes more and more clear to us. I think that alternative forms of living, banding together, all of those might be more apparent. And you're also going to see this out migration from the big cities like New York, like wherever else. So I think that this might be that moment of inflection where you do see a demand for a bigger state. You do see a sort of out migration from big cities, and you possibly see newer forms of social relations forming, especially around new kinds of collective ownership of property even.
Yeah. Andrew, do you have any other questions before we think about actions?
I think I have finished all the questions.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, we've been here for a while, so that's totally fine. I guess I think it would be interesting to think as a group about
what people can do.
Yeah, what actions can be taken to actually get us towards this. And I think there's a ton of energy behind UBI right now, and we sort of still feel like our only way of doing this is to vote a politician in, and we've got other sort of crises on our hands. And I guess my question for everybody is like, what do you think we can do right now? Like, what can the average person do to get us towards this? Is it something like start a sort of collectivized donation-based fund, or is it campaigning, or do you have a sense of what people should be doing if they really want to get us closer towards the UBI world?
Do you want to go first?
I think just in terms of, I think giving, there are opportunities like, Give Directly, which is responsible for the pilots in Kenya, is a way to contribute to pilots. But I do think that this needs more concentrated political action. In a certain way, it's not going to happen. I mean, Andrew Yang was, I suppose, the closest one could get to a certain kind of, mainstreaming of UBI as a discussion. I know that we discussed this a little bit, but I think that we need to understand this much better in a certain way, at least like in different contexts, in different, how is it going to work? How is it going to be sustained? Those questions, I think, need to be asked and answered. So I think like just, getting people together, a campaign around this is going to be interesting, but also I think that we, going back to the fact, I think we need more pilots in a certain way in different parts of the world to demonstrate what this can and cannot be.
Great.
And I say, yeah, if you want to give money to support a basic income now, I would agree with Asha, give directly. because Give Directly is supporting a basic income right now that is going to some of the poorest people in the world. They're doing it on a large scale, and they're collecting the evidence that it works. So it not only, and they're using a UBI model. So they're demonstrating that UBI works, and they're helping people at the same time. If you want to give money to make for UBI, you can do that now, and that's the best venue there is. There might be some other ones cropping up, but that's the big one now. But for as far as making it a political reality, a true basic income political reality, it's going to vary by place to place. You want to find out what's going on in your community, and then find out what's not going on that you can do, or what's going on that you can help with, or just what's missing that you could start on your own. A lot of people are having fantastic ideas. I'll have some idea, wow, I wish I had time to do that. And then I'll read about, oh, there's somebody in Australia doing that. So there's so much going on basic income. You can find things to look at is that the Yang Gang that formed in support of Andrew Yang's candidacy did not just disband when he left. If you're in the United States, you can contact the local Yang Gang and see what they're doing to support basic income. They're mostly about basic income. Also in the US, there's now a UBI caucus of a bunch of candidates who are running on basic income. There are probably equivalents to that in other parts of the world. There is then two twin movements that are kind of working together. In the United States, we had a basic income march last fall for the first time. That spread all over the world to over 30 cities around the world. And it's called, the group that's supporting that is called Income Movement. And they're doing more. They're going to have another big march next fall, COVID permitting, and doing other forms of political activism. You could contact them to see if they have anything in your area or if you can do something. Then there's another one that has been doing this even longer, which is called Basic Income Week. That's been going on since 2006, a week of political activism. It started in Austria and Germany. It was international because it was two countries. Now it's all over the world. Contact Basic Income Week or Income Movement to find political activism around the world. And even I don't know if Yang Gangs are going international, but I've seen like Australia Yang Gang or something. Those three things, but also if you want to get involved in the research end of it, there's things like Basic Income Earth Network and the United States Guaranteed Income Network. You could contact them. There's a lot of ways that you can get involved in campaigning for this issue.
Nice. Okay, that sounds wonderful. So it sounds like the main sort of actions are run your own experiments, get in touch with people who are running experiments in your local area, political shift through finding organizations that are already working on this stuff. And if you want to financially contribute, the suggested ways to give directly, who are not only funding but also doing the research.
Oh, I wasn't really talking about running your own experiments. I was talking about running your own political activism. Mm-hmm. Activism can be done on a one-person basis. Mm-hmm. Experiments takes a lot of money.
Yeah.
If you want to support experiments, give directly. Unless you're a really influential person. If you are, say, the Lutheran Archbishop of Namibia, you might be able to start an experiment, as the Lutheran Archbishop of Namibia did in 2008. Mm-hmm. If you're just some guy like me, you probably can't start your own experiment, but you can do writing. You can do activism, you can contact other activists and stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, the experiment I meant, I think, just as a community of researchers and, getting philanthropists and donors interested in the idea. And since we do have the networks to do that, and then, checking, I mean, like the Finland experiment, there are some examples of this happening globally. So to be involved in those would also be useful.
Nice.